Second, the release has triggered an immediate political fight over transparency redactions and whether the government is protecting the wrong people while exposing the wrong victims. And third, it's all unfolding alongside a familiar Trump-era pattern: legal threats aimed at public critics, high-profile institutional shake-ups, and a widening debate over how power is being used, especially when it touches the press, culture, and the justice system. So in this video, we're going to slow the pace down and make sense of what's happening and why it matters. So in this video, we're going to slow the pace down and make sense of what's happening and why it matters. Not as a rapid-fire news update and not as a courtroom-only legal story, but as a political strategy story about incentives, risks, and the kind of governance model that emerges when legal process, public attention, and partisan advantage start to overlap. The starting point is the release itself. On January 30th, 2026, the Department of Justice announced it had published more than 3 million additional pages responsive to the Epstein-file's Transparency Act, plus thousands of videos and a very large volume of images. This was framed by the department as compliance, part of a rolling production in response to a law that President Trump signed in November 2025. But almost immediately, the release generated two competing reactions. One reaction was political, lawmakers and commentators scanning the material for references to powerful people, and then arguing over what those references mean, what should be public, and what is still being withheld. The other reaction was human and arguably more important: survivors and their advocates condemning the way the release was handled, saying victim-identifying information appeared while alleged abusers and enablers remain protected through redactions. That tension between maximum transparency and do no further harm is not a side detail. It's the core ethical conflict of this entire episode, and politically, it's also the core vulnerability of whoever is managing the release, because mistakes here don't just cause embarrassment, they can create real-world consequences and a backlash that crosses ideological lines. ABC News reported Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche defended the process while acknowledging that errors can happen at this volume and that officials were working to correct them. And that brings us to a key political fact: who is in charge of the process? Todd Blanche is not a typical background name in a document release story. He is a senior Justice Department official now, but he's also widely known for his role as Trump's defense attorney in the recent past. That overlap is one reason the release is being interpreted through a political lens rather than as a routine bureaucratic compliance exercise. Even if every decision is defensible on paper, the optics are inherently combustible. The people responsible for releasing politically sensitive material include individuals with recent, direct ties to the president. And in politics, optics aren't just aesthetics. They shape whether the public trusts the process. Now let's talk about what the release has done to the political environment. In the last few days, you can see three dynamics developing at once. 1. A renewed demand for full disclosure. Paired with accusations of selective secrecy, the Justice Department has described its actions as compliance with the law. But reporting from outlets like The Guardian describes lawmakers arguing that millions of pages remain unreleased or are too heavily redacted, raising accusations of a cover-up. Whether that claim is ultimately proven or not, it functions politically in a very predictable way. Once you release some, you increase pressure to release all, because partial transparency often looks like curation, and curation invites suspicion. Even people who don't follow the details will recognize the pattern. If you're confident the files don't show wrongdoing by powerful figures, why not release everything you legally can while protecting victims? That's the frame that makes this story last. 2. The Trump team's counterframe: this proves nothing about me. President Trump has publicly rejected the idea that the Epstein material implicates him, and the Justice Department has not accused him of crimes connected to Epstein. At the same time, the political risk for Trump isn't only legal, it's reputational. The release recenters a topic Trump would likely prefer not to dominate the news cycle because it ties into long-standing public reporting about Epstein's social network and the way wealth and power operated around him. And that's why you see a third dynamic. 3. Escalation against the story carriers, comedians, journalists, and institutions. This is where the Grammys moment becomes politically relevant. Multiple outlets reported that after Grammys host Trevor Noah made a joke referencing Trump and Epstein's island, Trump threatened to sue Noah, calling the joke defamatory and denying ever being on the island. It's tempting to treat that as celebrity drama. But politically, it's doing work. Legal threats, even if they never become successful lawsuits, can deter repetition. They signal to allies and opponents that the president intends to fight the narrative in every arena, courts, media, and culture. It's also a way of repositioning the story. Instead of the headline being "What's in the files?", the headline becomes "Trump versus the people talking about the files." That shift matters because attention is finite. Changing the target changes what the public remembers. Now, before we analyze motivations, we need to step back and clarify what these files are and what they are not. The Epstein-file's Transparency Act appears to have forced a scale of disclosure far beyond what's typical, including raw investigatory material and media. But raw files are messy. They contain unverified claims, partial recollections, context-free contact records, and investigative leads that may never have resulted in charges. So politically, a mention in a document becomes a Rorschach test. Some observers interpret mentions as evidence of wrongdoing. Others argue that mentions can reflect proximity, not culpability, especially when Epstein moved through elite circles. The responsible position is the careful one. The files can raise questions and provide leads, but they do not automatically establish guilt. And the Justice Department itself has emphasized that many documents include claims that are untrue or sensational, and that prominent names appearing in records does not equal a criminal accusation. That nuance is easy to lose in the politics of the moment because politics rewards certainty, not caution, and that leads directly into strategy. Let's break down what the key players appear to be optimizing for. 1. The Justice Department's strategy: compliance with guardrails. The DOJ's stated objective is legal compliance while protecting victims, but the backlash shows the nightmare scenario for any government release, being accused simultaneously of hiding too much and exposing too much. From a political management perspective, DOJ leadership has incentives to show volume, millions of pages, to demonstrate effort, emphasize process, hundreds of reviewers, redaction protocols, to signal seriousness, and treat mistakes as inevitable at scale, then promise corrections. The risk is that volume doesn't automatically generate trust. If anything, volume can look like a tactic, flooding the zone with documents, so no single narrative dominates. Some analysts argue that a document dump can function like information overload, technically transparent, but practically hard for the public to interpret. That doesn't require a conspiracy to be true, it's just a predictable effect of scale. 2. The White House strategy: deny, counterpunch, reframe. Trump's posture is straightforward: deny any wrongdoing and attack the credibility of the narrative ecosystem around the story. Threatening to sue Trevor Noah fits that pattern. In political terms, this does a few things. It rallies supporters who see Trump as unfairly targeted by elite media and entertainment. It warns fence-sitters, especially institutional actors, that repeating claims may carry legal or political cost. It turns criticism into a personal dispute, which is easier to manage than a sprawling disclosure story. But the strategy also has risks. Legal threats can keep a story alive longer because they create a new hook for journalists. They also invite scrutiny of the underlying facts, meaning they can unintentionally amplify the very association they're meant to suppress. 3. Congressional strategy, oversight theater, and real oversight. Lawmakers pushing for more disclosure are operating in two modes at once. Mode 1 is genuine oversight, demanding compliance, asking why material appears withheld, and pressing DOJ leadership in hearings. Mode 2 is political positioning, showing voters they are willing to challenge powerful institutions and wealthy elites. The Epstein story is uniquely potent because it combines public disgust toward elite impunity, long-standing distrust in institutions, and a victim-centered moral urgency. That's why it's politically dangerous for any administration, left or right, to look like it's protecting insiders. 4. The press freedom strategy. Question: where does journalism end and activism begin? Now we need to connect this to another major development mentioned in the transcript, the arrest of Don Lemon. The Associated Press reported that Don Lemon and another independent journalist, Georgia Fort, were among those arrested and indicted after covering, or allegedly participating in, an anti-IC protest at a church in St. Paul, Minnesota, under federal civil rights charges related to disrupting congregants' rights. This story is politically sensitive for two reasons. First, it can be framed as a press freedom issue. If journalists are arrested in connection with covering protests, it may chill reporting, even if prosecutors insist the arrests are about conduct, not journalism. Second, it can be framed as a rule of law issue. If the government argues that specific actions crossed a legal line, it will emphasize that no one is above the law, including media figures. Both frames can be true in different parts of the public mind, which is why this becomes such a powerful political conflict. The deeper political question is whether the administration benefits from blurring the line between critical journalism and organized activism, because that blur makes it easier to portray unfavorable coverage as illegitimate. To be clear, whether Lemon's conduct meets the legal standard is for courts to decide, but the political effect is immediate. The arrest becomes a signal to the broader media environment about risk. Broader political implications. So what does all of this add up to? A. Institutional trust is being stress-tested on multiple fronts. The Epstein release tests whether the DOJ can be seen as both transparent and protective of victims. The Don Lemon case tests whether enforcement decisions will be perceived as neutral or politically selective. When these controversies stack, the public doesn't separate them neatly. People form an overall impression. Is the system fair? That impression has political consequences far beyond this week's headlines, because trust is one of the few assets governments can't easily rebuild once it's lost. B. Culture and politics are becoming harder to separate. Another development: Trump announced that the Kennedy Center would halt entertainment operations for 2 years during renovations. Even if this is defensible as a renovation plan, it sits inside a broader cultural conflict. The Kennedy Center is not just a building, it's a symbol of national cultural prestige. When it becomes a political object, every operational decision is interpreted as a political message. Politically, this can benefit a leader who thrives on cultural confrontation because it keeps politics present in everyday life, award shows, performances, public institutions, rather than confined to policy debates. But it also risks backlash from constituencies that may not be partisan, but do care about institutional continuity and cultural autonomy. C. Litigation is functioning as both legal tool and political message. Trump's lawsuit against the IRS and the Treasury Department, seeking $10 billion over the leak of his tax information, has been widely reported, including via Reuters coverage carried by The Guardian, and other outlets. Again, there's a legitimate legal question here. What remedies are available when taxpayer information is unlawfully disclosed? But politically, the lawsuit also serves as a signal. It reinforces the narrative that Trump is a victim of government misconduct. It reframes a damaging disclosure, his taxes, into an offensive legal campaign. And it keeps pressure on agencies that are, at least formally, part of the executive branch he leads. This is one of those moments where governance and politics merge. When a sitting president sues parts of the government, the public is forced to ask whether the state is a neutral administrator or a battlefield. What could happen next? Looking forward, there are several plausible paths, none guaranteed. More releases, more disputes over redactions. The DOJ has described its production as compliance and rolling publication. If additional material emerges with errors that expose victims, the political backlash could broaden and force procedural changes or judicial intervention, congressional escalation. With survivor groups urging accountability and lawmakers demanding access, hearings are likely to become a major stage for this story. A continued strategy of narrative counterattack. The threat to sue Trevor Noah suggests Trump may keep contesting the story in court of public opinion terms, not only by denial, but by targeting messengers. A broader debate about press conduct and protest coverage. The Don Lemon case could become a reference point for how future protests are policed and how journalists assess risk in covering them, especially if more high-profile figures are charged. Institutional spillover. The Kennedy Center closure plan could turn into a sustained debate over cultural governance and political influence in national institutions. If you step back, the story isn't only that new Epstein files dropped or that Trump is feuding with another public figure. The deeper story is about how modern political power operates under conditions of extreme attention. Document releases that should be about accountability become political weapons. Redaction mistakes become moral crises. Cultural institutions become partisan symbols, and legal tactics become messaging tactics. In the short term, this produces noise, an overload of claims, counterclaims, and competing narratives. But in the long term, what matters is whether institutions can maintain legitimacy while operating in a political environment that constantly rewards escalation. That's the real significance of this moment. Not one document dump, not one arrest, not one lawsuit threat, but the pattern forming across all of them.